Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, the FDA has approved a new non-opioid painkiller for the first time in over 2 decades, and giving us new drugs to play with. FDA approves the trial of pig kidney transplants, and this may or may not yet help with the organ shortage for those who desperately need new kidneys. Caffeine could affect your body fat and diabetes risk, which for the most part isn't news to anyone. Octopuses have the oldest sex chromosomes amongst all of the animals, which explains that they've basically been throwing their penis at their partner and telling themselves to go get fucked forever. Peeing is contagious amongst apes, and also explains some of humanity's behavior, where, for some strange reason, women have this phenomena where they will travel as a group to the bathroom, and also squat whenever a photo occurs. Australia's orca whales are preying upon a major, let's say, marine predator, although perhaps that term's not entirely correct. The synthetic yeast project has effectively achieved completion, having finalized the genome. The US Navy shares photos of its ridiculously large laser that they've mounted on a destroyer, as an attempt to deal with various threats. An interesting article looking at the contents of a water filter both before and after use. Stanford's AI is, let's call it controversial, as it's supposed to be able to establish whether or not you're gay or straight based on a single photo. And finally, we have AI being used in the creation of proteins, although this particular development is extremely controversial. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with everybody's favorite thing, drugs. Now, the kind of drug you may prefer is going to vary drastically. It may simply be caffeine, such as that in tea or coffee. In other instances, it could be something more, let's say, illegally dubious. What is not dubious is the approval for a new painkiller that is not an opioid and therefore is incredibly important. Understand, most of the current strong prescription type medication is arguably either going to be an opioid or an opioid derivative. Now there are some exceptions, but the key thing here is that the opioid derived products are not good news. They're addictive, they have the risk of overdose, and of course, they can arguably create complications such as opioid-induced pain, which is an irony of epic proportions where painkillers cause pain. The new, let's call it drug for now, is a analgesic or painkiller, and it's called suzetrigine, and it works by blocking certain proteins involved in the sodium channels in nerve cells. For all intents and purposes, it literally stops the nerves that would otherwise transmit pain, your nociceptors, from sending that signal back to the brain, and therefore, you don't have the perception of pain. You certainly are still feeling it, you just don't know you're feeling it, and that's particularly important. The fun part here is that it appears to be derived, at least in part, from Japanese pufferfish, fugu, where they have a particularly nasty poison in them called tetrodotoxin. This, in larger doses, is rather obviously fatal. In smaller doses, however, it causes a tingling and enjoyable sensation, and in just the right dose, it appears to prevent pain. The best, let's say, part of all is that beyond all of the benefits we've mentioned so far, is that it is incredibly potent. Understand, we are talking amazing levels, thousands of times better than other options level of potent. The other important thing here is that theoretically, if we were to use it, we either can be using pufferfish, which are arguably the worst way to get this, or synthesizing it, which should be viable. And as a result of that, we shouldn't need to harm any fish in order to get it. However, if you'd like your own free dose, go to your local Japanese restaurant and see if they serve fugu, and you might get lucky. Or you might die if they've not prepared the fish correctly. In slightly less immediately useful, but hopefully far longer term useful news, we have the FDA approving clinical trials for genetically edited pigs that allow for the transplant of their kidneys into humans. This is not the first of kind. In fact, it is an ongoing issue, and there have been a number of attempts so far to use genetically modified organs from pigs to put them into humans. The reason for this is very direct and very simple. There are far few donors and far too many people who need various organs, kidneys being amongst the top of the candidate list. You more or less go kidney, liver, and then heart. After that, it's probably going to be the pancreas, followed by things like the lungs and other organs. But overall, the numbers are pretty clear. Kidneys, at least for now, are the leading thing in demand, with up to 100,000 people just in the USA needing a kidney, and that's 1 out of 2, let alone if they need both replaced. The, let's say, strength of this is several-fold, one of which is already pigs are reasonably close to a human, so theoretically their kidneys are more or less a plug-and-play type scenario. However, because of the issues around the immune system, you can't do that without them eventually leading to complications. The genetic modification removes a lot of the markers, if not all of them, that should make these kidneys recognizable by the immune system. The next advantage is simply that, well, the pigs grow reasonably fast. You can go from a piglet to a pretty much fully sized adult pig in about 6 months, if not up to 12. But that's far less time than you would, say, need to get a human clone. And of course, finally, well, the pigs have 2 kidneys. You can obviously use one and then the second in another patient, if the companies want to be cheap. That does mean that it's much cheaper and easier, and arguably an almost on-demand scenario, wherein somebody can get a replacement kidney as soon as needed. We'll wait and see how the clinical trial goes, but it's certainly a significant and important development in the ongoing scenario where we talk about organ donations and organ transplant. Less useful news, and this time we talk less useful in quite literal terms. It's the attempt in humanity to try and grow a human that can reach every last light bulb and top shelf in the world. Well, not quite. It's the fact that men have grown twice the rate in height as women have over the last 100 years, which is a bizarre phenomenon. It raises more questions as to why is it that men are getting taller at a much faster rate than women. It's not as though we're in a competition with giraffes, so there's no great reason why it should be true. The data, though, is pretty compelling. It's about 135,000 people, and it's across 62 countries. It is, however, about 20-odd years old. In order to get to the historical element, they looked at historical data from the last 120-odd years from the United Kingdom. What they found is that, as we've said previously, there is simply sexual dimorphism. Men are generally bigger, both taller and more muscular than women, and women are, generally speaking, somewhat smaller and slightly less muscular than men. It's a somewhat inverse relationship to, say, spiders, where typically the female spider is much larger than the smaller male spider. Partly because, much like with cougars, the adult female spider can eat the young male spider. Interestingly, the research also found certain mate trait selection in heterosexual women, and that's relatively consistent with everything else that's generally thought of as a trope or stereotype. That is, heterosexual women generally like men who are taller, heavier, and essentially more masculine. Conversely, heterosexual men prefer mating smaller and slimmer females. Why this is up for debate, but still, it's more or less consistent with what we've mentioned previously in other videos. In other weird human anatomy and development things, we have our ears. Now, not the fact that our ears are weird and will basically continue growing throughout our entire life, although that is bizarre. No, it's the fact that our ears, despite the fact that even today they're relatively set in place, will try and move in response to various stimuli around us, particularly sounds. Somewhat obvious, but it's not just sounds that could, say, startle you. You could be lights, it could be someone appearing and speaking, it could be a smell. All sorts of things can suddenly stimulate you. The fact that we have the ability to, even remotely and very weakly, move our ears indicates that these, not only now, but certainly in evolutionary terms going way back when, had a certain amount of advantage, let's say, in being able to swivel. Imagine if you look at a cat. A cat's ears can move fairly freely around its head. We're not saying they can go completely anywhere and everywhere they want, but they can move quite a bit, and that's partly to help them look for prey. They can move their ears and try and find where the sound is coming from and almost triangulate it. With our ears located on the sides of our head and where they are, that's not so practical to do. But if they could move just a little bit, well, things change quite a bit. The German research, however, is a bit weird. Most German research is weird, but this is particularly so. What they've done is take 20 healthy adults with no neurological, cognitive, or hearing defects, which sounds like it's the starting list of a bad movie from the 1940s. They then fitted electromyographical sensors to their ears to listen to the muscles as they move around the ear and see if they're trying to pull on the ear to get an idea about what's going on. They then provided various auditory stimuli. The end result in summary is that although drastically weakened and certainly nowhere near capable, all of the neurological systems in place to move the muscles are still there, meaning that if the muscles were theoretically trained or at least developed, they could do exactly the same thing as what a cat or dog can do, just slightly less cute. Going on to news that many people will appreciate, caffeine could reduce your, or at least affect, your body fat and diabetes risk, which, again, isn't that surprising. And to be clear about it, caffeine is not a miracle drug by any stretch of the imagination. Let's be clear about this. Instead, it would be more appropriate to say that caffeine has been shown to have a consistent beneficial effect in some respects. But, like all things, it has its downsides. As such, you need to balance the good and the bad when you conclude whether or not you actually think it has use, or, in other instances, the merits you get from drinking caffeine are all well and good and you're happy for them, but the demerits you consider a trade-off. Or, inversely, that you consider any demerits a risk and the gains you have, such as being able to wake and function, just a mild benefit. The research is based out of, effectively, the north of Europe, Nordic countries. It's the combination of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden and the University of Bristol in the UK and Imperial College in the UK. They had calorie-free caffeinated drinks, so think of Diet Coke, Pepsi, things like that. And they then analysed what happens with the individuals who are consuming these. Now, theoretically, and understand there's a big caveat to all of this, the caffeine should have been the only thing that was significant here. And what they found, unsurprisingly, given that they're basically consuming diet beverages, was a lower BMI. This isn't a surprise. You've not consumed sugar. You're not getting the calories. That shouldn't be worth writing about. But building on that is where things get to be more useful. The presence of caffeine may be related to a reduced risk of things like type 2 diabetes. But, and this is the big but here, the actual dose wasn't established. They can't establish that there is any relationship between concentration of caffeine in plasma or blood and its effect on this. Yeah. So for now, we would argue that this is a nice possible benefit, but not necessarily anything established or proven. What has been proven, and is arguably far more alarming, is that cows have been infected with a new version of bird flu. That is more concerning, and for very good reason. The fact that it's spread into birds isn't a massive worry. We would expect to see that avian influenza spreads amongst birds and mutates amongst birds, for two major reasons. One is it has a more ready transmission between bird species. Second, because it's spreading between more species, and there are a very great diverse range of both wild and domesticated species, it has a much higher chance of mutating. Once that happens, well, it's going to continue to spread, assuming that it's at least somewhat more competitive versus the previous leading strain. It's the same phenomenon we see with COVID-19. Getting it in cows, however, that's another issue entirely. We saw it occurring in cows throughout America, and that's affected all sorts of things, but mostly the dairy industry and the ability to produce milk, because people are stupid and think raw milk is great and then get themselves infected, or give it to cats and infect the cats, or just in general are stupid. But the second variant of avian influenza in cows? That's another matter entirely, and that is a concern. Not just because it means great, another variant of avian influenza to infect cows and therefore reducing milk production and consequently things like cheese, yogurt, and milk obviously, but cheese being important, that's a problem. For particularly elderly individuals, although arguably anyone, this D1.1 version of avian influenza is a worry as it's shown itself to be particularly dangerous. In America at least, of the 67 Americans who have been infected with avian influenza, only one has died, which you could think of as a silver lining of sorts. But, and this is the big catch, the one man who died happened to be infected with this new version of avian influenza, and it appears so did the Canadian girl who was relatively recently infected by it. Although, at least she didn't die, she just happened to have to go on life support and she had organ failure, which obviously is a rather serious illness, and you can imagine that her time was not fun in the hospital. No happy clowns visiting superstars and so on, and mostly breathing through a straw and hoping that she'll recover. The other worry, at least with regards to this new variant, is somewhat more worrying in terms of the dairy industry. Not just the people working in that industry, but for the cattle involved. At least in theory, at the moment, the nature of the new variant of avian influenza could theoretically mean that those who are already infected with the prior variant of avian influenza, that is the B.3.13, could be infected with the new D1.1 variant, which does mean that although cows would be safe at least from the original strain, would now be vulnerable to the new strain. Yay for viruses mutating. In more marine-based news, or at least more animal news from the marine environment, we have octopuses and their really old sex chromosomes. Octopuses are weird, and not just if you watch the cultured Japanese programs that are available in the more seedy parts of the interwebs, but also because they are just plain creepy. Anything that has 8 limbs should not exist. We don't care if it sounds like we're preaching for a genocide of octopuses, squids, and so on. If it has more than 4 legs, it's gotta go. Spiders? No. Octopuses? No. We can't think of anything else at the moment that has more than 4 legs other than insects. What makes the octopus particularly creepy is the way their limbs work, and how their penis arms are particularly dexterous. But part of that could be the fact that their sex chromosomes are really, really ancient. 480 million years at least, and arguably even further back again. The reason we know this is genetic profiling of ancient examples of octopuses and the fact that at least modern octopuses have the inverse of the human sex chromosome system, wherein the male has 2 copies of the same chromosome and the female has a mismatched pair of chromosomes. Effectively, the XX would be the male in the case of an octopus, whereas it'd be the female in a human, and XY in the case of a human male and octopus female. The ancient octopuses appeared to be notably different in this regard, wherein they were at least missing one of the copies of what they needed. In further sex-related news, although this time even more bizarre and weird sex-related news, it's the ongoing story, let's say, perhaps it's better to call it a biography, of the mouse that was created using 2 fathers and 0 mother, which has survived, weirdly enough. The mouse was made using essentially weird messed up versions of genetic engineering. Not genetic engineering in that you might think of like changing out a gene for one for the other. Rather, what they've done is take a cell, and by meddling with it, they could stimulate it to turn back into a pluripotent stem cell. Then they could take the sperm of the adult male mouse and stimulate the pluripotent stem cell into an egg, combine the two, and now you have your bizarre 2 father no mother mouse. That mouse, as mentioned, is still alive, a year or so later, which, given the life expectancy of most research rodents, is an achievement by itself. Typically speaking, they meet their end relatively quickly. Relatively quickly in that, depending on the experiment, it can be between 6 and 24 months, if not less again. Already, and certainly by itself at this stage, it's a fairly major achievement, but there are two fairly significant caveats to this weird two-father child. The first is fairly straightforward. They don't appear to be capable of reproducing themselves, which does mean they are, for all intents and purposes, sterile. The other is rather more morbid, let's say. About half of those they attempted to make did not make it to adulthood, and about 90% of the seemingly viable embryos did not succeed in being birthed. This means that you have somewhere along the lines of a 5% success rate in making it to adulthood. It's unfortunate, but the odds are not in the favor of these mice. You could almost compare them to the odds of surviving as a female child in the one-child era. You had a very low chance of being successful in life, unfortunately. And this is perhaps one reason why the research is kind of important. Not just the fact that it shows us a way to do weird shit with regards to making stem cells and theoretically giving, say, homosexual couples the opportunity to be able to have kids of their own, but it also speaks to things around, say, genetic health. It would appear, at least according to the research, that none of the disorders that were associated with the parents were carried on to the offspring, which does mean that, theoretically, and I understand there's a lot of questions still, that the health of the child is better than the adult, if they don't want to have kids of their own. If this sounds promising to you, there is still a big catch, and that is, according to the researchers, there is some issue around the fact that a number of genes, at least 20 that they've identified, were silenced, and that's because they carried 2 copies of the same gene, but both were cancelled out in this case it would be the father's. Whereas, typically speaking, you would get an active version from one parent and an inactive version from the other parent. You didn't get that in this case. They were both turned off, in short terms. In more social news, we have the idea that if you need to go to the toilet and you're an ape, it could be a contagious phenomena. That is, for example, if you want to yawn, or you start coughing, those around you will do the same thing. Peeing could be similar in certain groups of captive chimpanzees. We used the somewhat esoteric joke earlier of the idea that, say, women having photographs taken will all suddenly squat or duck, or they'll go to the toilet as a group, but possibly speaking, at least in the latter instance, it could be something we can trace back to our chimp ancestors, or at least ape ancestors. In order to establish this, the Japanese researchers at Kyoto University spent a unnatural amount of time observing a group of 16 male and 4 female chimps, and seeing whether or not they would pee as a group. As they describe it, synchronized peeing, or at least within 60 seconds of each other. And yes, it would appear that the peeing phenomena was not random. Yeah, Japanese research gets weirder every day. Sometimes we find it's remarkable in how it grows, such as being able to have female and female produce offspring in the case of mice, and sometimes it's watching chimps pee. They do believe, at least with regards to the behavioral and social element of this, it's not the closeness of people that dictates whether or not they're going to go to the toilet together. Rather, it's a social hierarchy. That is, for some strange phenomena, if somebody higher up in the social hierarchy goes off to pee, those lower in the social hierarchy will follow them to also pee. Those who pee together stay together, perhaps? In other group-based phenomena, we have Australia showing that it is still a hell world, or a death world, or whatever you wish to call it. It's based on observations of great white sharks, or orcas, and how they're preying upon a particular species of what should otherwise be predators. They are instead hunting down white sharks. Yes, this phenomena is already weird enough, but it's not just that they're hunting down the white sharks, but instead that they're hunting them down and only taking their livers. This sounds more and more like the orca is behaving like a serial killer, stealing trophies stealing perhaps being an operative word there, instead of being a weird animal behavior. It's not just a one-off thing, it does appear to be fairly widespread. In fact, it's occurred in a number of instances, and worse yet, they've had to rely on what is practically forensic evidence in the form of DNA sequencing to find out who's responsible. It's worth pointing out that although the orca is otherwise known as the killer whale, it's not actually a member of the whale family. Instead, it's more closely attached to the dolphin family, which also explains some of their behavior. Dolphins are arguably arseholes. Whether it is sexually harassing individuals in the water, beating up seals and penguins, or other, let's say, psychopathic behavior, dolphins are mean and nasty. The fact that we now have a relative of the dolphin family as a whole in the form of orcas hunting down sharks and eating only parts of them and then leaving the rest to float away is not really that mind-blowing. Terrible in terms of sort of human morals if you were to apply them, but still not awesome. Next we have news that gives credence to our earlier statement that anything with 4 legs should be destroyed. It's a fungus turning spiders into zombies. Now, this won't solve the fungus issue, but it will take away its host and thereby prevent the spread of this fungus. And possibly the start of The Walking Dead, or possibly in other instances The Last of Us. Which, if we stop that now, we may never get a live action or second game, which could be seen as a net benefit. The fungus is kind of nightmarish, and strangely enough, found in Northern Ireland. But it's not just found in Northern Ireland, which is already odd by itself, but it was found in an abandoned gunpowder room, that is, somewhere to store black powder for, well, old weapons, and theoretically, more recently, things like, say, a cordite for larger caliber weapons. The, let's say, sycophantic particular species of fungi was discovered by, somewhat ironically, BBC documentary crews. The crew then sent the weird fungi-embedded spider off to be identified, along with the fungi itself, and they found that the fungi was a new species. And they then named it Gibelia attenboroughi, after Sir David Attenborough, which this doesn't seem like an exactly, let's say, a promising naming sense, but perhaps somebody has a different view on whether or not this should be seen as something worth being proud of or worth being embarrassed by. Or what the fungi does is arguably very similar to what another fungi that infects ants in South America does. That is, it hijacks the central nervous system of the, let's say, victim, and tells it to go somewhere where it doesn't naturally go of its own accord normally. In this case, going outside to the essentially exposed outside world, far away from their own trap and home. In the case of ants, it's going high up into a tree where it can release its spores, but for the spiders, it's going out somewhere rather prominent and clear where it can then spread the spores, which kind of makes sense. Going beyond creepy fungi, we instead have the interesting article that looked at the ability to design and use bioengineered bacteria for environmental purposes, and how arguably it's going to be necessary, at least to some extent, to regulate their application if they're ever going to be released into the wider environment. Now, to be clear about it, there are certainly ways, places, and times for this to be used. For example, some microbes may be the only way to deal with, say, plastics on a larger scale, or, for example, trying to sequester carbon in certain ways, perhaps to produce certain things for the environment, such as an enhanced fixing of nitrogen, and there are a variety of other things, but the clear problem is going to be, how do you use them, and how can you do so in a way that is going to not only provide the necessary benefits, but not create more complexities down the track? Effectively, is there a way to do this in the way you would fight a fire, by spraying water on it, rather than spraying more fire on fire to try and burn it out? The commercial release of the engineered bacteria are the crux of that problem, and it's not like this is new either. The earliest bioengineered bacteria go back roughly 60 to 70 years now, mostly looking at the production of certain biological products, like, for example, hormones. in terms of what's going to go out into the environment, the article raises some pretty legitimate and rather serious questions. For example, how persistent will the bacteria be in the field, for instance? Will they disperse beyond the targeted site? Will there be concerns about transmitting the various genes that they carry to the native or local microbes, and thereby changing them substantially? This is always known as horizontal gene transfer. Are we selecting for appropriate species of bacteria for this purpose, and is there going to be at least some degree of agreement across the scientific community, a degree of consensus as to what are the appropriate types of things to do and how do we deal with them? And finally, particularly if we talk about, say, bacteriophages, that are viruses that particularly predate on bacteria, how do we ensure that we don't screw them up, in short? All of this, of course, ignores the fundamental issue of how do you contain them. We don't just mean in general terms, but for example, how do you ensure that the safety switches, that is, do they have an inbuilt death signal? Or is there some other way to prevent them from going beyond what you're trying to do? Now, we're not going to go through the entire article. It's both long and in depth, but we will provide the link in the description box below, and it's very much worth a read. In similar news, but this time looking slightly more basic again, we have the synthetic yeast project essentially achieving its end game. That is, it has completely finalized every chromosome of a yeast cell and yeast genome built from the ground up. They have had to create 16 completely new chromosomes with everything needed for the yeast to not only live but function, but also to take away everything possible that it does not need. They have taken the Henry Ford approach to invention. That is, invention is not adding everything that you could possibly add, but instead paring away everything that you do not possibly need. This again is not an article we're going to go through in great depth, for two reasons. First of all, we already have a video dedicated to the synthetic yeast project that you'll find linked, but more importantly than that, what the article goes through is a great deal of detail on what they've done and all the necessary steps, changes, and so on that were required to do what they have done. And remember, they are essentially building an organism from the ground up, creating DNA from scratch, or at least close enough to. That explaining everything is neither practical nor really feasible inside a video that's going to remain under an hour, and that's just on that topic alone. Shifting to other news that's archaeological now, and somewhat environmental, we have the supposed finding of a city in the mid-Atlantic ridge. This is a part of the ocean, and the claim is that they found what appears to be a city. Now, the claims of it being a lost city are probably going to be significantly overblown. That won't, however, stop the History Channel from claiming that, for example, this is the lost city of Atlantis. We will take a rather more grounded approach to it. What they've found are essentially giant vents that spew out hot air, various hot water, and a variety of other minerals and essential things for life. And this is arguably where the idea of it being called a city comes from. Understand that this is not a new thing. It's been found way back in the year 2000 or thereabouts. But even before then, for the roughly 120 or so thousand years before then, it was working its way upwards and out of the Earth's mantle. Remembering that these vents are found more than 700 meters below the Earth's surface, or the ocean surface to be clear, and as such, where they are is not just incredibly cold, but incredibly dark, and it's why they're so important for life. These giant chimneys that constantly put out heat, gases, and so on are there to provide everything needed for local life forms to survive, whether it's shrimps, crustaceans, sea urchins, eels, and more. And that's the key thing here. They provide everything needed for life in an area that should otherwise be completely and utterly inhospitable to any kind of life. In other sea-based news, or this time above the waves rather than below them, the US Navy has shared developments, let's call them, of their giant laser. And in this case, we think they may be taking a great deal of inspiration from Fallout. It's a 60 kilowatt laser called the Helios Combat Laser. Helios stands for High Energy Laser with Integrated Optical Dazzler and Surveillance. It's essentially a giant, huge-ass laser. There's no reason to be fancy about this, but, well, bureaucrats and other groups like their weird acronyms to make names, so Helios it is. What it does is it deals with things like, say, drones and similar. It's the ability to be able to hit them very quickly, because, well, laser travels speed of light, and burn them up, or at least overheat them and destroy them that way. Or in other examples, you might use unmanned aerial surveillance vehicles, again, drones, or fast attack craft. If none of these are to the Navy's liking, well, we could always point them towards the Brotherhood of Steel. Sure, steel walking armored suits might be resistant, but a giant laser typically is going to beat them. The reason that this is so important is, well, as mentioned, a huge-ass laser. 60 kilowatts is not insignificant. But more than that, it has huge range, which is weird to say considering how far a laser has to shoot. But it's also very flexible, very fast working, and it's very portable. So long as you can see the target, you can hit the target for all intents and purposes, which does admittedly present certain roadblocks as, to a certain extent, you can only see so far, even on the open ocean, and of course when you have things like bad weather and similar, the distance for which you can, for lack of a better phrase, fire this weapon does shrink notably. Despite this, the USS Preble is currently carrying it around in the South China Sea, or in that area, as it originally went to Japan, where it was testing its system, and then proceeded to annoy China. It's likely not to be the only example, at the moment, of directed energy weapons on board a naval ship. It's just the only one we've been told about. In other energy-related news, we have a nuclear power plant that was helping to reduce the risk of flooding, which is a seemingly weird oxymoron. You would think a nuclear power plant, given how much water it uses for cooling, would actually be the opposite effect. It would theoretically increase the risk of flooding, because if any water escapes from it, it should cause problems. Except in this case, where the Kankakee River was essentially frozen over. The water released from the nuclear power plant helped to not just break up that ice somewhat, thereby allowing the free movement of water, but in doing so, used its hot, cooling water to great effect. Now, the benefit of this is fairly straightforward. Hot cooling water comes out of nuclear station, cold cooling water comes in. Much more efficient cooling of nuclear material, or whatever they've used it for. Therefore, at least in theory, everybody wins. At least everybody wins except for those who are trying to ice fish, because, well, no more ice fishing for you. Next we have other news that's sort of related to radiation, but it's a CT scan of water filters. And it's an interesting article from Lumerfield. What they looked at was a variety of different water filter designs and the idea of what happens once you run them. Now, remember that they're using a CT scan here, so what they provide is somewhat limited, and we would certainly be critical of them in that respect. The idea is very simple, that sure, we can see a nice interesting picture, but a nice interesting picture would be better if you gave us some numbers. Particularly something like, say, the ratio from before and after of certain things. But they haven't really done that. They've told us very little about differences in density other than what's visually there. And of course, since this is CT scans, they will be getting a JSON file, and that JSON file should have been relatively easily analyzed using something like, say, 3D Slicer, ImageJ, or something like that. The arguable benefits of this are more than just the cool pictures. It shows you a lot about how these filters are working. For example, when they looked at, say, picture filters, when they looked at something like carbon-based filters, particularly those used for, say, refrigerators, life straws, reverse osmosis filters, and more. All of these show interesting developments in terms of what's actually going on in the changes, and you can certainly argue the different kind of materials used in these different filters. We'll leave it at that for now, as we certainly don't want to take away from all of the work they've done, but it's definitely worth a read to see what it is that they found in their research. In news that's going to be more technologically current, we have AI. And yes, AI is this thing that everybody screams about how wonderful it is. It's not so wonderful, but it's somewhat useful. Less useful in most respects is claims that AI can analyze a photo and effectively predict your personality traits and career trajectory. Now let's be clear about this. There is some evidence of, let's say, names, sort of dictating what you'll become when you get older. For example, if you have the last name of Baker, the probability of you becoming a baker later on in life is significantly higher. Admittedly, names like Smith don't really work so well anymore because, well, there aren't that many more blacksmiths, but the general idea applies. Some names will predict outcomes. But your facial appearance, that one's a bit more questionable. Partly because, well, faces vary drastically and there's no real one face type for most things outside of very clear stereotypes. The purported value, let's call it, of this is that Yale believes the AI can, let's say, find the truth in people's face where they might otherwise be not dishonest, but certainly twist the truth a bit when it comes to, say, survey questions or interview questions. For example, if you ask somebody about their principles, morals, or, let's say, for lack of a better word, core tenets, they may something to align with the school, the business, whatever it is, whereas their actual feelings might not be quite so aligned. The research itself does recognize that it has major limitations in that they focused only on the big 5 personality traits, these being openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So it is very clearly limiting what it can tell you, which arguably is somewhat more useful. But that's also arguably a major weakness to this. After all, if you can only say 5 things about an individual, well, that may not be all that helpful, particularly if you're looking at, say, employing them, and even then whether or not you can use this as part of an employment application process. The other issue with it is that there's a fairly big spread in what it can actually achieve in terms of the application of this to a real-world scenario. For example, the scenario in which they ran through a lot of LinkedIn profiles to look at MBAs and figure out what was going on based on their AI's ability to analyze. The same idea applies to Stanford research, which is admittedly several years older, but it speaks considerably to the not just power, but the progress we've made in AI, and in certain respects, how far we've regressed with AI. The Stanford University AI is supposed to be able to tell if you're gay or straight based on a single photo of your face, which is weird. Not just because, generally speaking, there's a great deal of variability in faces, again, but there doesn't seem to be a gay face, so to say. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. The other catch here is that the dataset that the researchers were relying on is notable. It's specifically calling on data from a dating site. As such, everybody is not just openly public about their sexuality, but obviously everybody is looking for a partner as such. The other thing here is that the findings are, let's say, controversial, in that they found, at least claim to have found, gay men tend to have a gender atypical feature. This is a fancy way of saying they looked more feminine. The inverse being true for female, which kind of plays into both the stereotype for a butch lesbian and very effeminate gay man. The fact that it seems to align with stereotypes may or may not be strengthened by the fact that it had a kind of weak accuracy. Understand we say weak in that, given its relatively small sampling size, it is probably doing pretty well. It could detect gay and straight males with 81% accuracy and 74% of the time for females. Which, given we're talking only about a photo here, and as mentioned earlier, a fairly small sample size of about 35,000 photos, it's not really that bad. Let's be clear about it. Most datasets on which AI, and it's not AI, but anyway, are trained are millions and millions and millions of people, if not billions of data sets, people and so on big. We're talking about crazy amounts of data. They did this with 35,000 images. Also noteworthy that humans tend to be, to be blunt about it, considerably less reliable, with 61% accuracy for men and 54% for women. Surprisingly at the time, and rather prescient, is concerns that, this could be used for nefarious purposes, such as off to Gulag with you for being gay. In Off to Gulag, we have China's spy, or at least a purported spy, that was stealing AI technology, and this could be fairly significant. Now, the individual was a former, now Google engineer, and they are being charged with trade secret theft from back in March of 2024. The US prosecutors believe that they were involved in transmitting data from Google as their time as a software engineer to China, and a notable amount of data at that too. This and other similar phenomena is one of the reasons why last week we made a particular point of, say, DeepSeek and its sudden emergence to great acclaim by various people, possibly being not as hyped up as it should be, or at least it was. In simple terms, we don't know how much of it is built on stolen technology like this, something which we may or may not get flack for, has been fairly well established for a lot of companies in China who will, for all intents and purposes, either steal or seize intellectual property if companies willingly go to China. Now, if they don't willingly go, they'll send someone to the country in question and get their technology that way, and then apply it themselves. If DeepSeek is relying on something like this, and for example, they're relying on the 1,000 or so files that the individual in question sent, could be a big problem when they go to actually develop and build on the technology. The final news item we have for you is also AI related, but this time it's completely the opposite. Rather than being overblown by the outside world, it's instead being heavily criticized by academia. It's an AI that created a new glowing protein by simulating millions and millions of years of evolution. In fact, 500 million years of evolution. Now, the catch with all of this is that although they've created the theoretical development of this, and to be clear about it, we're talking theoretical as in everything is on paper, or in this case, in the cloud more than likely, it's never actually been made. Yeah, the key thing here is that rather than relying on what could be best described as trial and error and development of whatever it is in a laboratory and building up to this, they've jumped all of the intermediary steps and gone straight to the end result of this is the sequence for the protein and this is how we'd make it, which that's nice, but have you actually made it? And therein lies the big catch here. It hasn't been made. That's where academia is criticizing this publication. It sounds all well and good when you say we have a new fluorescent green protein or an alternative thereof. It's not so awesome when you say, but we've only got a theory. We haven't ever actually proved it and shown that it is there. There's no validation, there's no synthesis, and there's no testing. It does, however, pose some, let's say, proof of concept in that AI can be used to design these things and work our way through them, which could, and I'm saying there's a lot of salt to be taken with that could statement, shorten the time frame needed for the development of a lot of things that otherwise we just don't have now. But every time we say they could shorten it, that assumes that whatever the AI has led to the production of actually works. And one of the problems will be, if it doesn't work as expected, because the AI is largely responsible for the development and creation of it, we may not necessarily be able to troubleshoot and figure out backwards what's going on and get a solution to a otherwise surmountable problem done the old-fashioned way. It's not to say technology isn't awesome, just that the technology has limitations. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.